On a muggy Tuesday morning in August, Richard Nelson, a newly appointed police chief, arrived at the Blue Ridge Precinct, a small town nestled in the rolling hills of North Carolina. He was dressed simply, wearing a plaid shirt, jeans, and worn sneakers, far from the expected uniform of a man who had spent 2 decades climbing the ranks in law enforcement. This was exactly his plan: to blend in. Richard didn't want to see his officers behind polished meeting rooms or rehearsed greetings. As a black man stepping into the leadership of a department tainted by whispers of misconduct, he needed to see them as they truly were, unfiltered. His arrival went unnoticed at first. The precinct parking lot was bustling with officers, some arriving and others heading out. Richard observed it all quietly, blending in with the flow of the day. No one seemed to recognize him, which was unsurprising since his appointment had only been announced days earlier. Choosing not to publicize his arrival, he had planned to conduct an informal inspection that morning. Taking a deep breath, Richard walked toward the building, adjusting the brim of his baseball cap. His mission was clear: root out the deep-seated toxicity that had taken root within this precinct. He knew this wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face the challenge. Inside, the precinct was alive with the usual noise: officers chatting at their desks, phones ringing, and the hum of day-to-day work. Richard moved quietly through the hall, observing, his eyes scanning the room. He paused outside the break room, where a sharp voice suddenly cut through the noise. "Hey, you!" The officer's tone was sharp and condescending. Richard turned to face him. The officer, Officer Daniels, smirked as he approached. "Lost? This isn't a shelter," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Behind him, a few other officers leaned casually against the wall, watching the interaction with interest. Richard felt a sting of anger but held it in check. He hadn't expected to be welcomed with open arms, but he hadn't anticipated this kind of hostility either. "Get out of here," Daniels sneered. "We don't need people like you around." The group behind Daniels burst into laughter, and Richard clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He considered confronting the officer, but before he could speak, Daniels stepped closer and spat in Richard's face. The laughter around them grew louder, as the group clearly found the moment amusing. Richard stood frozen for a moment, his pulse quickening, but he didn't react impulsively. Instead, he calmly reached into his pocket, pulling out a handkerchief, and wiped the spit from his face. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through those doors?" Richard asked, his voice calm yet firm. Daniel smirked. "Only the ones who don't belong." The laughter continued, but Richard said nothing more. He simply turned and walked toward the precinct's main office, determined to address what he had just witnessed. Inside the briefing room, officers were gathered, chatting amongst themselves. Daniel still stood with a smug expression, leaning against the wall, unaware of what was about to unfold. Captain Harris, a stout man with a graying mustache, called the meeting to order. "Settle down," Harris said. "We've got an important introduction today." Richard stepped forward from a side door, holding a folder that bore the precinct's official seal. The room fell silent as he made his way to the podium, his presence commanding attention. He paused for a moment, scanning the room. "Good morning," Richard began, his voice steady, measured. "My name is Richard Nelson, and I'm your new chief of police." The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel's smirk faltered, his face going pale as he finally recognized Richard. The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, some whispering to each other. "When I arrived this morning," Richard continued, "I came in plain clothes because I wanted to see the department for what it truly was. What I witnessed was eye-opening." Richard let the room digest his words before raising a hand to silence the murmurs. "In my short time here, I've already seen behavior that is not only unprofessional but downright unacceptable. Let me make one thing clear. The culture that has been allowed to fester here ends today." A murmur rippled through the room, but Richard's voice cut through it, steady and unwavering. "Respect is not optional," he declared. "It is the foundation of everything we do as law enforcement. Without respect we fail, each other, and the community we serve." He let his words linger, letting the officers absorb the weight of what he was saying. He focused his gaze on Daniels, who was now visibly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "I witnessed something this morning that can never happen again. Some of you laughed when you thought I was just another powerless man. But let me remind you, everyone who walks through those doors deserves respect, whether they wear a badge or not." Richard's voice was firm, yet controlled, as he turned his attention to the room. "I understand that change is difficult, but there will be no tolerance for behavior that disrespects anyone, colleague, civilian, or otherwise." He stepped away from the podium, walking toward the officers with purpose. "Officer Daniels," Richard said, stopping just a few feet away from the man. Daniels flinched, his bravado completely gone. "You represent everything that's broken in this department," Richard continued, locking eyes with him. "When you spat in my face, you disrespected not just me, but the badge, the oath, and the community we swore to protect." Daniels tried to stammer a response, but Richard interrupted. "That's exactly the problem," he said sharply. "You didn't care. You didn't take a moment to think before you acted, because you assumed that man standing in front of you didn't matter. That assumption is why this department has lost the trust of the people we serve." Richard let the silence hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "This isn't just one man's mistake," he said, his voice rising slightly. "It's a culture where bullying and prejudice are not only tolerated, but celebrated. And that stops now." He stepped back toward the podium, his tone now commanding. "I've spent my career fighting for justice, both on the streets and within the walls of departments like this one. Change won't come overnight, but as long as I'm chief, this precinct will operate with integrity, respect, and accountability." The room was still, every officer feeling the weight of Richard's words. "Effective immediately," Richard continued, "Officer Daniels is suspended, pending an internal investigation. And for those of you who think this is just a slap on the wrist, think again. This is only the beginning." Gasps echoed through the room as Daniels' face turned red. He tried to avoid the stares of his peers, but Richard wasn't finished. "This isn't about punishment," Richard said, his voice firm. "It's about setting a standard. If you can't rise to that standard, then this isn't the place for you." The officers shuffled out of the room in silence, their usual chatter replaced by a contemplative quiet. As they left, Richard stood tall at the podium, his mind already focused on the challenges ahead. Back in his office, Richard sat down at his desk, exhaling deeply. He knew this was only the beginning. The road to change would be long, and there would be resistance, but he was determined to fight for the values he believed in. As the phone rang on his desk, Richard answered, knowing that this was just the first of many battles to come.